Most people think they're thinking, but without a system, there's no telling where those thoughts are even headed. We all have blind spots and biases. We unknowingly make leaps in logic and feel like our half finished ideas are complete. It happens to all of us. We learn just enough to feel smart while headed in the complete wrong direction. Everyone says, think for yourself, but no one shows you how. Most people just either parrot the crowd or react against it, and neither is real thinking. If you can't define your thoughts step by step, you don't own them. You're just borrowing with no way of verifying their accuracy, which is why you keep getting taken advantage of. Thinking for yourself means learning the correct structure of thought, defining terms clearly, following logic step by step, testing your conclusions, and stripping away bias until what's left is actually yours. If you don't ask the right questions, you won't get the right answers. I, for example, spent almost a year trying to figure out how to make money on YouTube without ever stopping to think about how to actually make the videos better. I was so wrapped up in the content ideas and the business systems aspects because on Spotify, I had built up about 40,000 followers without ever having to worry about the presentation. No one could see me. So I assumed incorrectly that the same logic would carry over. So I had this massive blind spot that cost me a lot of time. And when it hit me that I'd been overlooking like the most obvious thing, actually making the video and making it look halfway decent, I felt like a complete idiot. But that frustration and embarrassment was one of the best lessons that I've ever learned. You have to be careful with how you think. Otherwise, the mental effort could be completely wasted. I was grinding, but because I wasn't asking the right questions, I was never going to land on the right answers. And imagine if I had given up there. The only reason I didn't is because this is my mission and I'm dead set on building a viable online business. But if I'm being honest, when it comes to things like politics, history, philosophy, and whatever else, I don't always push myself in the same way. Those things aren't priorities. So that means half the time I walk around thinking I know more than I do, when in reality, I just stopped digging. And I'll confess, in the past, I've thrown around the chant of do your own research. And what I really meant was the same thing everyone else means when they say that. Research my position with an open mind so that you can see that I'm right. Let's take politics as an example. Both sides say this to do your own research, and both sides have people who actually do their own research. So, how is it that out of all the political ideologies, with all of their shades of nuance and with all the variations across history, most people in this country are pretty much always locked into one of two positions? You're not looking at everything. And it's not because you're dumb unless you voted for Harambe, because our brains are wired to take shortcuts. It's not efficient to work every problem out from scratch. We're built to imitate others because that usually increases our odds of being right. We're built to form opinions quickly because the faster we can decide, the faster we can act. And once we act, we get feedback. If we're right, great. If not, we adjust. A bias for quick decisions and immediate action is the fastest way to learn. The problem is that most people only have a bias for jumping to conclusions. They don't follow through with the action, so their conclusions are never tested. Instead, they mistake surface level signals for actual validation, like seeing other people agree or hearing the news confirm their opinion. And that's confirmation bias at work. We're not open enough to the possibility of being wrong, so we stop the process halfway, identify with untested conclusions, and call it truth. Doing market research for this episode, I realized that most of the advice on this topic is both generic and generally unhelpful. The people talking about how to think for yourself usually fall into one of two categories. Either it's weird influencers who over dramatize entry level ideas, slap a new label on them, and act like they've unlocked the secret key to life, and it's really just like the most basic advice ever, or it's straight up narcissistic self validation. And that second kind is honestly the worst. Like, ooh, no one can tell you what to think. Just live your own truth, whatever that happens to be, no matter how ridiculous, because who cares how you present yourself to the world? You be different and you force everyone to conform to your delusion. It's not like learning how to actually control the frame of perception would give you real power in the world. No. That doesn't matter. Just be a rebel for its own sake because you've still got unresolved issues with your parents. I'm not going to give you that. My goal is to teach you how to see and use the hidden mechanics of human behavior so you can stop getting misled, manipulated, and left behind and start aligning your strategy for life with the way your brain actually works. Then, once you grasp how to manage yourself, expand to using these principles to get other people to do what you want. So, the first step is to define and frame clearly. Vagueness is the enemy of clarity. If you can't define a term, you can't think about it. If you can't fully picture the situation, you're walking into a war with no knowledge of the enemy. That's dangerous because you don't know what you don't know. We hear things like think logically and believe that we are. We think that we're applying that logic, but without understanding what it actually is. Logic in its purest form is simply the discipline of moving from one true statement to the next without contradiction. So, what's our process for thinking logically? Is it just compartmentalizing our emotions, asking questions to get more information? It's a great start and you should do it. But how do you know you're asking the right questions? How do you know you landed on the right conclusion? Even if you had the right information. I struggled with math growing up, and it's one of those things I just didn't get. All the information was right there in front of me, but I would mess up knowing how to actually apply it. Sometimes I'd follow the formulas correctly, but still get lost on what the answer even meant. Other times I would get most of the process right, but one small miscalculation would throw everything else off. And sometimes I would just flat out use the wrong formula. It's silly to think that this doesn't show up everywhere else in life. Math just makes the problem obvious because the formulas and steps expose where your thinking went wrong. Those miscalculations are a lot like cognitive biases. They're predictable wrenches in the process that distort the outcome. Standardized testing even weaponizes this. Multiple choice answers are built around the mistakes that you're most likely to make so you feel like you got it right. They're meant to trick you. Now, listen, if a high school math teacher can do that, why wouldn't the mainstream media, corporations, political campaigns, or anyone else do the exact same thing? They expect your biases and arrange options so you feel like you solved something and never question the manipulation. Likewise, shouldn't we also expect individuals to do this too? You might not go around scheming about how to trick others to get ahead, but plenty of people do. They may not have full blown systems mapped out, but think about it. You've only spent a little bit of time considering these strategies for the past 2 minutes and probably already have ideas on how they might be used. It's really not that hard. So picture someone who's lived in that mindset their whole life. A manipulator who spent years thinking about how to outmaneuver people has definitely picked up on ways to steer you towards a conclusion while making you believe it was your idea all along. So to protect ourselves, we need clarity. But clarity alone is not enough. You also need to know what to do with it. You need frameworks and formulas for how to think. Otherwise, you're just guessing, and you don't know for sure if your thought process is even moving in the right direction. The right systems apply to questions about mental health just as much as they do about algebra. Real quick, I want to run through the actual system I developed for doing this, for clarifying your thoughts, keeping track of the most dangerous cognitive biases that you're going to run into, so that you can make sure you're actually landing on conclusions that you can trust. And if you'd like a copy of this, I've put together everything in a free PDF that I'll send to you if you check out the description. It started off as a writing tool, but I actually kind of started using it for all kinds of problem solving without even realizing it and ended up adapting it into just a general planning and strategic framework. So the first step is in the writing section would be the thesis, but we're not going to get too much into that terminology. First up, pin down the claim in one clear sentence. If it falls apart, you never had an idea to begin with. The trap here is the illusion of clarity. When a vague thought feels complete simply because it lives in your head with the benefit of emotional weight. Next, frame the problem. Call it the wrong thing and you'll chase the wrong solution. The way you name it decides how you see it. And this is where the framing bias creeps in. Basically, once an issue is mislabeled, every piece of reasoning after that is distorted to fit the wrong label. Then next, you're going to surface the tension or bring the tension to the surface. Every idea has a hidden spark, whether it's curiosity, fear, conflict, whatever. That's the thing that makes it worth your energy. If you miss that, the idea won't feel important enough for you or anyone else to stay with it. This is basically the pathos aspect of the argument, and it's super important. But the danger is the salience bias. The mind basically latches on to what seems most vivid or attention grabbing, even if it's the wrong detail, while the real issue is left untouched. Next, justify the focus. Not every problem is worth solving. And if you can't explain in one clear sentence why this deserves attention, it doesn't. Here, the trap is mostly confirmation bias, which tricks you into assuming that an idea is important simply because you already care about it. Then structure the reasoning. No rambling, no skip steps. Each point has to hit that central claim directly and reinforce it step by step without making any assumptions so that any person can follow along and test it. This is where the full arsenal of traps really starts to show up. Confirmation bias makes you see what you expect to find. Motivated reasoning makes you decide first and justify later. Availability bias tempts you with vivid examples instead of representative data. Anchoring lets the first number or idea warp the rest. Base rate neglect is where you ignore the big picture and fixate on out of context details. Survivorship bias blinds you by only studying the winners, which can cause a lot of problems, believe it or not, and the illusion of explanatory depth or thinking that you know more than you do. Finally, the last step in this process is to close the loop. Don't leave it open ended just because it feels done. Force the therefore. What's the lesson, the decision, the next step? If there's no clear next step, then what are you even doing? You can think all day long, but this is ultimately a tool for taking better action. And this system works so well because each stage is a guardrail against bias, vagueness, misframing, sloppy logic, even misinformation, and false closure. Run your thoughts through this process, and what's left isn't opinion disguised as truth. It's thinking that you can own. And again, I'll email this template to you with a more in-depth explanation if you like. But thinking logically is not just about staying cool-headed. That's an important part of it, but it's not the actual process. Just like you need the right formula to figure out how many apples Johnny bought, you also need the right framework for how to think about your life. You can be sharp and even brilliant and still use the completely wrong method for reasoning about a relationship, a close friend, or a job and screw everything up, especially that relationship one. I see some pretty smart people getting destroyed and outplayed by some really dumb partners. But an easy example would be how you analyze a coworker is not the same as how you would analyze a friend. You trust your friends, and you should be more skeptical with strangers. Treating both with the same process, the same approach is like using the wrong formula on a test and getting a wrong answer that looks legit because it happens to be one of the choices. Then you pat yourself on the back and go, "Ooh, synchronicity, it's everywhere." Yeah, because it's by design. It's meant to distract and deceive you. And I'm staying on this part for so long because it was such a painful lesson for me. And I want to make sure I lay it out as simply as I can for you guys so that you get it faster and don't have to go through the same mess that I did. And ironically, I broke this rule when I was writing the episode. I had the idea, I organized a few thoughts, I just kind of threw them together, but I wasn't happy with how things were turning out. I was just trying to free write a little bit. It was confusing. I wasn't articulating myself well, and there was no real flow because there was no structure. I got up to about 4,000 words and I had a handful of good ideas, but none of them connected. I spent a whole day frustrated and wanting to quit, freaking out about how, I'm done with content. I'm not cut out for this crap. But I finally took a step back and I said, okay, I know what I'm trying to do. And I can see where there's a lot of noise, a lot of clutter. The skeletal structure was super off and unfocused. So I honed in on the two half-formed thoughts that actually had some potential, scrapped everything else, did some research, clarified the original idea, and started over. This time using the principles that I'm talking about here. And in particular, the framework I was just talking about, which is actually, again, just the writing system that I developed a while back and had repurposed for daily decision making. From that point of view, I could finally start applying better thinking strategies. I saw that there were only a few real gems buried under a pile of junk. So I cut the noise and kept the bare bones. Then I started rebuilding from the ground up using a first principles approach, doing more research where I needed to. And when I had to decide how wide the scope of material should be, I used Occam's razor to keep it simple and concise. Instead of assuming my first answer was right, I went through a second order thinking approach and asked, what would it mean in practice if this was true? And then what logically must follow that? Is there evidence of those second order effects? If not, I missed something. If it does hold, then what problem does this solve for somebody? And that problem becomes my emotional hook. For a deeper breakdown of these tactics and more, check out my recent episode, The Art of Ignoring Almost Everything. But once I actually stopped and used the system that I had developed, the one that I'm teaching here, I realized it was the perfect example of a bigger truth. Just because you understand a concept does not mean you are applying it. If you never stop to analyze whether your thought process is effective, it's easy to assume you're stuck because of effort. You tell yourself it's too hard, or worse, that you're helpless, useless, powerless, but it might not be that at all. You could just be using the wrong approach. And it's tempting to learn a little bit about something and assume that you found the right conclusion, but the only way to know for sure is to treat that information like a hypothesis. Test it and stay open to whatever results you might get. Don't fall into the confirmation bias and only see what you want to see. Ask, is there real, tangible evidence? for this idea. And even then, people tend to stop way too early because evidence doesn't mean that you found the final answer. It just means that the idea is worth testing more. For example, I treated social skills this way for years, experimenting, implementing, coming up with conclusions, researching, testing my ideas and hypotheses, and making these theories about like how people behave and what they do and how I can interact with them better. I did this for years before I ever started thinking about putting it into content and making a show out of it. I've also been writing for 20 years, but it wasn't until a few months ago that I finally pulled everything together into a system that I had real confidence in. The only reason I caught the blind spot that I had with this whole episode is because I write content every day. If I hadn't written since April, I would still be working from an incomplete picture. And that's why you have to test your ideas as often as you can. You can't just find some obscure niche online group that agrees with you and call it proof. If you really believe something is true, then you should live like it's true. That's the essence of philosophy, to attempt to live a true life. You don't know if you found truth until you put it into practice and face the consequences. Every time you do, you sharpen the edge a little bit more. And sometimes you realize that, hey, you've been moving in the wrong direction. That's okay. That's when you reset and start back over. And yeah, it may feel a little bit stifling at first to use a framework for thinking. That feels kind of weird and clunky to somebody that's never done it before. But once you learn the tool, it opens up its own kind of creativity. Learning musical scales feels boring too. But until you know what notes actually sound good together, you have less creative freedom. Thinking works the same way. And when you really get down to it, writing is thinking. You believe that you've got great ideas until you see them on paper and they don't look so good, or a screen too. I do most of my writing on a computer these days. Without the emotional glow that they had in your head, your thoughts look scattered, confused, and inarticulate. People see this and assume that they're bad at writing, but in reality, that's just what raw, unfiltered thoughts look like. Without a habit of sorting them out, it's almost impossible to sharpen them. That's why writing is so important because it forces you to face your mistakes and work through problems in a way that you cannot hide from. The same way a math problem is easy to evaluate once it's written out, putting your thoughts on paper or a screen has the same effect. When you can write down your central point, get super clear on it, figure out exactly what needs to be true for you to be right, and then explain the reasoning in simple terms, you will be amazed at how much better you get at thinking, at communicating, and at persuading people to actually take you seriously. You can develop some real influence this way. So if you want to think more clearly, learn to write, but write in a way that is structured. Talking about a problem without a system for working through it is just keeping a diary, which is fine if that's what you want to do, but you shouldn't assume that it's going to be useful. Again, writing is thinking, and psychology gives you the instruction manual for how your brain actually works, and therefore the tools to think correctly. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate your time and attention. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And also check out that link if you are interested in getting the full PDF version of that framework, along with some instructions on how to use it on a daily basis. And also if you want to use it for some sort of journaling or writing practice. But either way, it's a very simple, glanceable tool that you can just look at, pull out. And even if you don't go through the whole system, you can just look at the different points that are highlighted there. It wasn't the focus of this episode, so I didn't go super in depth into it, but it's there if you want it. I'll see you guys soon.